Hello, psychology. Welcome to the study of psychopathology. The study of psychopathology is the study of psychological disorders. To be more detailed, psychopathology is the study of abnormal thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. If you get a chance to take a class in abnormal psych, it is essentially the study of psychopathology. If you hear that term, you might think of psychopath in a negative light. Actually, it's probably closer to the term sociopath. Right? A sociopath is a person that doesn't have a conscience. The term psychopathology is used in pop culture oftentimes, but psychopathology is a scientific study of abnormal thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. In years past, in decades and millennia past, if you had psychological difficulty, then the world was not good for you. In the ancient times, evil spirits were released via trepanation. This is a boring of a hole into the skull to release what were thought to be evil spirits that remained in the skull. Then there was a movement among Hippocrates, the idea that mental illness comes from an imbalance in the body's four humors. So the idea then moved throughout history, the idea that what led to abnormal behavior was an imbalance in four different fluids throughout the body. In time, this idea would also give way to the Middle Ages. During the Middle Ages, this idea that the mentally ill were inevitably involved in witchcraft. So if you've studied the Salem witch trials, this is the idea that witches or people that had fascination with the dark world were inevitably those same folks that had psychological problems, hearing voices. And if you look at this painting, this actually depicts a person who is tormented by evil spirits. And for those of you who have had individuals in your life that have been diagnosed with a psychological condition, it can feel to many like this is like an impression. What makes a person abnormal? Psychologically speaking, in terms of psychopathology, we're looking for a few different things. Social norm deviance, a person deviates from the social norm. This action or feeling or behavior is statistically rare. This person is dealing with subjective discomfort. The person is unable to function in life. And the person is a threat to themselves or to others. These are all things that we would look in the field psychopathology and be concerned about. So in other cultures, there are abnormal behaviors, but there are some things in our culture that would be considered abnormal that are considered normal here, and vice versa. And if you look at a socio-cultural perspective, the idea here is that a society can be structured in such a way that lends itself to psychological difficulty. So for instance, we are raising our children on lots of electronics, a lot of electronic devices, which many psychologists have suggested that this is directly related to very high attention deficit disorder rate that we have. Also, our emphasis on beauty and body shape and body type could also be related to our body image disorders, such as anorexia and nervosa. So for instance, anorexia does not exist in societies where there is no television and where there is no cell phone. Yes, there are societies that are primitive that do not have access to these kind of body image displays and body image messages. So in a society that's not being inundated and flooded with images of beauty, people do not have a body image disorder where they think that they're overweight, when in all actuality they're severely underweight. Different explanations for psychopathology exist, different explanations for mental health disorders and for schizophrenia specifically. So the biological model is one which says that abnormal behavior is created when biological events in the body cause these problems. So here you have a picture of a man who is holding a sign. He's clearly struggling with mental illness. Could very well be paranoid schizophrenia, could very well be homeless, dealing with mental health issues. And if you read the sign, the women and men of Hollywood need to approach and speak to Dana Lee Klug about hell. This sign claims specialized knowledge, which is a symptom and a feature of paranoid schizophrenia. And from the biological perspective, when a person has elevated dopamine levels in their brain, we can see hallucinations and delusions. Specifically, antipsychotic medicines will lower the rate of dopamine that a person has in their brain. And so there are different models of abnormality. So the psychodynamic perspective, behavioral perspective, and the cognitive perspective. And each of them are examples that do tackle this problem of psychological abnormality. The DSM-5 is out. The DSM-5 is actually the diagnostic and statistical manual which gives clinical descriptions of what these disorders look like in real life. So what would it take for someone to be diagnosed with a psychological problem? It would take the person meeting criteria as spelled out in the DSM-5. So you have axis 1, you have axis 2, axis 3, axis 4. And then you have axis 5 as well. So if you take a look at axis 1, these are conditions that usually require clinical attention. Now, in my class and in this lecture archive, I will only have time to really deal with axis 1. When you get to axis 2, although we will speak about this shortly, I spend most of my time talking about axis 1 disorders. These are the ones that you're most familiar with. Axis 3, you have medical conditions that can lead to psychological abnormality. And then you also have axis 4, which are social and environmental problems impacting treatment. So like the coronavirus would be an example. Natural disasters would be an example. And the fifth axis is global assessment of functioning. So this is a number. Diagnosticians would give a number that would sort of sum up how a person is functioning. How capable are they of functioning, or how incapable are they of functioning in society? So here you have a breakdown of axis 1, 2, and 3, and as well as 4 and 5. So if you take a look at these disorders, I just want to go through them if we can. You have Disorder is usually diagnosed in infancy, childhood, or adolescence. So this would be learning disabilities, ADHD, bedwetting, and speech disorder. Each of these categories, so about 15 categories, each of them have hundreds of different diagnostic possibilities. So you go from disorders diagnosed in childhood to disorders that are diagnosed in latter adulthood usually. So you probably know kids with learning disabilities, and you probably know adults with Alzheimer's. You may not have met someone with a psychological disorder due to a general medical condition, such as a personality change because of a brain tumor. Chances are you know someone that has a substance-related disorder, such as alcoholism or drug addiction. You probably know someone with schizophrenia, or you know of it. Now, schizophrenia, it actually happens a lot less in our society than alcoholism or drug use. We look at mood disorders and anxiety disorders, as well as somatoform and fictitious disorders. So if we look at the sexual and gender identity disorders, this has been changed from the DSM-4-TR to the DSM-5. Now gender identity disorder has been changed to gender identity dysphoria. Been something of a downgrade. If a person was born female and identifies as male, they are no longer, most likely, are not going to be identified as being disordered. But the preferred term at this point is gender identity dysphoria. Eating disorders such as anorexia and bulimia. The marked difference between anorexia and bulimia is that anorexia involves a person who's significantly underweight. Folks usually tend to focus on the binging and the purging that you see, but with bulimia, however, the major difference between these two is the significant weight loss, and many have body image issues as well. About 22% of adults suffer from mental disorder, major depression being the most common. Major depression, as well as other depressive disorders, affect over 20 million people in our country. In terms of schizophrenia, this is only affecting about 2 million. Only 1% of the population. However, is very visible. Whereas you have 10 million people that have been diagnosed with dysthymia in any given year, and yet most of my students have never heard of this. Almost all have heard of schizophrenia and have some notion of this. And so I make the contention that schizophrenia is just very visible. In terms of anxiety disorders, this is also very visible in that panic attacks happen in public spaces oftentimes, or you might have celebrities that have talked about their panic attacks or panic disorders. Obsessive compulsive disorder, which involves obsessions and compulsions. Obsessions are thoughts, and compulsions are actions. The most frequent obsession for several years has been germs. And I would imagine that the numbers of people with obsessive compulsive disorder will be skyrocketing post 2020 in the coronavirus. PTSD, you see upticks in this after wartime events and after shooting events. So we have a lot of post-traumatic stress in our country. Now, a generalized anxiety disorder occurs when basically anxiety had no specific cause. There's no event necessarily that brings about the anxiety. It just becomes prominent. There's a social phobia, it's a fear of social situations, as well as agoraphobia, a fear of open spaces. So we're taking anxiety disorders first and just sort of making our way through this. Anxiety disorders, the main symptom is just excessive free-floating anxiety that's not related to any known or realistic source. This will include phobias. Many of my students report phobias over the years. Phobias would be extreme, unrealistic, and irrational, but yet persistent fears of a situation or a social activity. This really stems from a fear of negative evaluation in social situations. This could be acrophobia, right? Fear of heights, agoraphobia, fear of open spaces, arachnophobia, fear of spiders. Each of these, claustrophobia, fear of enclosed spaces. These are real. Perhaps you are one to have trisedectophobia, fear of the number 13. But obsessive compulsive disorder is a related disorder to specific phobias and phobias in general, because it is an anxiety disorder. It involves obsessions, which are thoughts, and compulsions, which are actions. So again, commonly this is germs, but it could be obsession about anything. So also a cousin of this would be panic disorder that involves panic attacks. Sudden, intense panic involving multiple physical and emotional symptoms. When people have a panic disorder with agoraphobia, this is fear of a panic attack in an unfamiliar or public place. The generalized anxiety disorder is a feeling of dread and doom and physical stress that lasts longer than 6 months. So depending on what school of thought you adhere to, any one of these might be an option. So the psychodynamic school contended that anxiety disorders come from repressed urges. The behavioral school might say that there's something reinforcing these behaviors. When it comes to the biological perspective, I think that this has really gained the most traction in recent years because of we have brain imaging software. We can compare the living brain of a person with schizophrenia to that with a person without schizophrenia. So this is pretty telling. So we can do a lot more real-time experimentation that we would not have even 40, 50 years ago. Somatoform disorders take the form of illness symptoms, but there's no real physical problems. They're a cousin to psychosomatic disorders and hypochondriasis. So you might have heard someone being referred to as a hypochondriac. Well, this is all kind of in the same category of somatoform disorders. So somatization, hypochondriasis, and conversion disorder. So somatization would be when a person has dramatic complaints of a specific symptom, but there's no real physical cause. Conversion disorder would be a loss of sensory or motor function, but no real physical cause. It may result from a stressor, though. And then hypochondriasis would be just being terrified of being sick. And again, a lot of times people throw this term around. Dissociative disorders are those in which there is a break with reality, a break in consciousness. So the picture that you see here is a man from New York State, and he disappeared for 15 years. This is a picture that comes from a Christmas Day photo in which he was reunited with his wife. He had several brain injuries, and after a car accident, He recovered from the hospital and had no knowledge of who he was. He was then released and found himself without any memory or recollection of who he was. So his episodic memory really wasn't there. That's the memory that we have of episodes, events. His declarative memory, however, or semantic memory, it's his memory of maybe historical events, that was intact, and his memory of how to do things, his procedural memory, that was intact. So he could tie his shoes and put clothes on. He just couldn't remember that he was married and had kids. So he ended up finding work and sort of built a new life, moved to a different town in Pennsylvania. And on Christmas Eve, bumped his head, and all of a sudden, here are his memories. It seems stranger than fiction, but this has been well documented in the news and in science. So he made a few phone calls and arrived at his home the very next day. So this is a sort of dissociative amnesia, where a person can have memory loss for personal information related to a traumatic event. A dissociative fugue would be in the same diagnostic category, but it is somewhat different in that here a person will sort of blank out. They may just start walking or running, maybe even getting their car and traveling somewhere without any recollection of this. They would have amnesia for the trip and even possibly personal identity during response to the trip. So dissociative identity disorder was formerly known as multiple personality disorder in the 80s. The name was changed, and here a person seems to have two or more distinct personalities. A traumatic event or the core personality blackouts, and a person then may reintegrate personalities. However, this has been extremely controversial. This is a picture of a woman named Sybil, and when I was a kid in the 80s, there was a book by the same name, and Sybil became a household name. I can remember my mother talking about this. But in the book, written by her psychologist, he claimed that she had over 250 different personalities living within her own personality, and she would have these splits and breaks. However, upon further examination into his case notes over the years, it became evident that he had stretched the truth some. He couldn't document all 250 personalities, and so the number of diagnosing the numbers of diagnosis for multiple personality disorder had really elevated, had rocketed. Since the name has been changed, this is rarely ever diagnosed. It is extremely rare at this point. Mood disorders are those which are most common in America, as I mentioned. They're also known as affective disorder. Mood disorder is mood that is severely disturbed. Dysthymia is a moderate depression. You think of this as a moderate version of bipolar because the depression is not as extreme and the high or the manic phase is not as extreme as well. This is something that goes on for 2 years or more, and it's a reaction to an external stressor. Cyclothymia involves mood swings from moderate depression to hypomania for 2 years or more. This would be the moderate version of bipolar, whereas dysthymia would be just a moderate form of depression. So yeah, I don't want to confuse you. I think I misspoke. Dysthymia and cyclothymia are different. Think of dysthymia as a moderate form of depression. It lasts 2 years or more and is directly related to an event, whereas cyclothymia involves mood swings from moderate depression to hypomania. Here you have extreme sadness, which is a Great Depression, and you have extreme elation, which is a manic episode. And mood disorders would include the severe depression with no cause, whereas dysthymia is directed to an event. Manic episodes are excessive excitement or energy, elation, or irritability. And bipolar are these severe mood swings. So bipolar would be the most frequently diagnosed, whereas cyclothymia is a moderate version of bipolar, and it probably flies under the radar quite a bit. With schizophrenia, also an axis 1 disorder, schizophrenia is a psychotic disorder, which means it involves a break with reality. Severely disordered thinking, bizarre behavior, and an inability to separate fantasy from realities. Or I don't know that I would use the word fantasy. I think I would use, it's a sensory, persons receive false sensory information. They see things that are not there and hear things that are not there. This is a picture of Russell Crowe in a dated movie now, A Beautiful Mind. I remember when this came out when I was in grad school in 2000, and it really is a remarkable portrayal of a real life story of a man who won a Nobel Prize with schizophrenia. However, most people with schizophrenia don't become world-renowned physicists, but the movie does portray someone experiencing mental health problems. Delusions. These are false sensory messages. Delusions are false beliefs. A person believes that things that are not real are real, like they believe that they are going to be abducted by aliens, and they really believe this, and you can't convince them otherwise. Hallucinations, however, are when a person sees things that don't exist. I tell my students that if you believe little green aliens are coming through the roof to get you, that's a delusion. If you start to see little green aliens coming through your roof, that is a hallucination. So be sure that you can get this distinction. People with schizophrenia oftentimes have a poor or flat affect. The flat affect is like a blank or sort of empty facial expression. If you go back earlier in the video and rewind to the biological perspective, the man who has the sign that the men and women of Hollywood, California need to approach and speak to Dana Lee Klug. His facial expression is the picture of a flat affect. Not smiling, not frowning, just almost empty. And this is what you see with people with schizophrenia. The picture that you see here is a woman who later had a psychotic break and killed these two boys. And she had a form of paranoid schizophrenia. She is living in a prison at this point. It's a state mental hospital. So she was found not guilty by reason of insanity, but she was found to be in need of living out the rest of her life in a Texas mental hospital. And she had a paranoid schizophrenia. This is where you have delusions of persecution. So she believed that she heard voices telling her to kill her kids, which she did. So very sad story when you think of the difficulty it is to live in a family with someone that has paranoid schizophrenia. I had a very memorable student who spoke openly about her son, and every night she locked her doors because her son, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, was not able to find a place to stay to be treated, and he would not take his medicine. In Mississippi, our state hospital had major funding cuts, and so this young man would be released every time he did something that was violent or hurtful. It was a kind of a same cycle. Police officers would pick him up. He would be detained for a few days. He would be sent to a stabilization hospital and then eventually to the mental hospital, and then because of funding would be released. And this would happen over and over and over. And whenever he was released, he did not take his medicine. There is a reduction of dopamine that reduces symptoms. So people with schizophrenia have high dopamine levels. 1 out of every 100 people worldwide have schizophrenia. Relatedness increases the chance. So if you have a first degree relative, such as a mother, your chances are elevated. If you have a mother and a father, both with schizophrenia, and you go through extreme stress in the world, then your chances increase as well. So we call this genetic predispositions. This creates physical risk for schizophrenia when there is sufficient stress. This leads us to axis 2 personality disorders. I'm going to sort of fast forward to a chart here. Personality disorders are excessively rigid patterns of relating to people. And they're broken down in the DSM to 3 different types: odd or eccentric, dramatic or erratic, anxious or fearful. Now, a paranoid personality disorder is a person with an extreme suspicion of others. But this is different than like a paranoid psychosis, or paranoid schizophrenia, because here you see that the person's very paranoid in their personality. A schizoid personality is a person that's very cool, loner, very distant, unwilling or unable to form close relationships with others. Schizotypal, difficult in forming social relationships, odd, eccentric, or magical beliefs. Then we get to the second type. These are pretty visible in society. So you have antisocial personality disorder. You've had some famous serial killers and cult leaders that have been diagnosed with antisocial personality. It is like a person lacks a conscience. They lack morals. They really don't have a problem with hurting others. And what's been fascinating is that to psychologists is that some people diagnosed with antisocial personality have families and children, but simply have a very chilling, cold personality that they might mask with an involvement in maybe socially benevolent causes. A borderline personality is a person who's very moody, unstable, and manipulative. Narcissistic would be a person who's very vain, self-involved. A person with histrionic personality disorder overreacts and uses excessive emotions to draw attention and manipulate others. Then you have the anxious and fearful types, avoidant, dependent, and obsessive compulsive. And these are sort of controlling, needy, and fearful folks, respectively. Different ways of understanding these personality types, from family relatedness to reinforcement to unresolved Freudian dilemmas. Now, I tell my students over and over that good sleep hygiene and good exercise outside is really the quickest way to improve mental health. Some people find that they get depressed during certain times of the year. This is seasonal affective disorder, or SAD. This is a mood disorder that causes, it's basically caused by a form of depression that's caused from lack of sunlight. The solution here is phototherapy. I had a student one time who talked about an aunt who had a happy box, and as a child, this young person didn't understand why their aunt would sit in front of this machine that looks kind of like an X-ray machine, but it emits light that elevates serotonin levels. Light, natural light, elevates our serotonin levels, and some artificial lighting can mimic this. In generally speaking, artificial lighting is not good for your mental health. No substitute for natural light. When you look in northern climates, most of the cases of seasonal affective disorder exist up north. That's the end of chapter 14, and I look forward to hearing your experience with loved ones with mental illness in your discussion board. Okay, take care.